The OM-1, but better. This is the OM-1 Mark II. So first off, let's start with the design of the OM-1 Mark II. This camera is very much similar in terms of design with the OM-1 Mark I. Almost identical, honestly, same shape, same weight, about 511 grams or 599 grams. And it's, you know, a good size. It's got a solid rubberized build to it. It's very strong and durable sort of camera. As an IP rating of 53, which makes this incredibly good for sort of very tough conditions such as heat and up to -10°C in freezing cold. So that's going to be great for more of those colder climates that you're shooting in. It's also splash and moisture resistant. So that means if you splash a little bit of water onto this camera, you can wipe it off and you'll be safe. Although do make sure you have a good weather resistant lens on this camera as well, as obviously once the lens is off, it's not exactly going to be weatherproof with an exposed sensor. In terms of battery life, this camera is pretty bloody superb. I started shooting the day with about 70% battery power, ran throughout the whole day, and now it's down to 26%, but it really does last a long time. You can get about 500 to 550 shots at most. That being said, if you do need to charge this camera, it does have a USB-C port, which is great, a lot more universal, which means you can charge this device a lot more easily on a lot more other different devices. I personally like to charge it with a small rig V-Lock battery. It's a little portable battery, lasts a long time. Plug it in this, and this baby can last forever. On the side here, you do have two SD card slots here, which is pretty much a standard, but I would have liked to have had a CFast or a CF Express slot here, as this camera does have a lot of cool functionalities in it that sort of require it to act that little bit faster and to read out images that much faster. That being said, the camera does have an increased RAM in comparison to the Mark I, so this camera does operate quicker than the Mark I. On the top of the camera here, you have your standard shutter button, your function dial, which is rubberized, so that makes it much easier to sort of use. You also have this button here, which adjusts the readout speed as well as the autofocus function, which is going to be very useful, as often you are going to be want to sort of shift in between different auto functionalities with this camera, as well as different readout speeds. The camera also does use a flip screen, which is great for your sort of selfie content and content where you want to sort of be a bit more in front of the camera. Although personally, this is just my taste, I'm not a fan of a flip screen. I would have preferred a tilt screen. It does get a bit annoying when you have this little tassel here, which you'd be crazy not to have this. And it's basically sort of snagging and getting in the way of this sort of monitor. So I'm not too crazy about the flip screen, but for some people, this is probably more practical. So let me know what you think about this flip screen in the comments below. All in all, like the feel of this camera, I love the rubber grip. It does make this camera much easier to hold, and it's not really that heavy. I mean, it can get a little bit heavier throughout the day if you're shooting with a longer lens, which if you're doing nature photography, you probably are shooting with a longer lens. But really, it's a light camera, and that means it's able to be built very sturdy. It doesn't feel like a toy. It doesn't feel like this plastic fin that can't stand the weather. It's very, very durable feeling camera. Now, in terms of the sensor, it is very much a typical sensor to the OM systems, which is the Micro Four Thirds sensor at 20 megapixels. As a Micro Four Thirds sensor means that the camera is much lighter than a full frame sensor. So you won't have to deal with carrying around an incredibly heavy sensor. You can sort of carry around much longer lenses without having to worry about a crazy amount of weight. It's really the big benefit of having a Micro Four Thirds sensor. That being said, I also would have liked to have had a little bit more dynamic range in this camera with a larger sensor, but I didn't mind the dynamic range when shooting with this camera. I shot a lot of animals, and it was a lot of the shadows were really well preserved. It's an absolutely great camera for shooting animals in nature. I love the image quality in all honesty. And the camera shoots at 14-bit RAW, which is actually better than the Mark I, which only shoots at 12-bit RAW. Now, as for the video quality, I am happy to say this camera is very good at video. It can do up to 4K 60p at H.265 or H.264. And what I really love about it is it can actually go up to 240 frames per second in full HD. Meaning you can get some really good slow-mo shots with this camera. Like 120 frames it can do, that's great, but 240 frames is crazy. Like, you can get some very interesting footage when shooting at 240 frames. It should also be noted that there is going to be some slight cropping when shooting at 120 frames or 240 frames. The base ISO of this camera is also 200 ISO. This includes video as well. Although in photo modes, you can go down to low 80 ISO when shooting with this camera. So now let's talk about the computational features inside the Mark II. Now these are a lot of features that are already included in the Mark 1, but a few of them have been upgraded, and I think they're just worth talking about in general, as they are, in my opinion, what make this camera so cool. For starters, you have focus stacking, which effectively combines 15 images shot at different depths of field to combine them together. This effectively extending the depth of field of your image. So if you want to shoot something, but some of it is just a bit out of focus, this focus stacking is going to be useful. Next up, you do have high-res shooting. So for those of you that aren't really a fan of the 20 megapixels, I know a lot of you are quite crazy about megapixels. Fortunately, you do have high-res shooting, which enables you to shoot at 50 megapixels handheld and 80 megapixels on a tripod. So this is going to be great for landscapes and a lot of still photography, but it's not going to be ideal when you're shooting animals or people, as in those cases, those subjects are going to be moving around a lot. And you do need to take a few seconds to process that image while shooting with it. So I wouldn't rely on high res unless you're absolutely sure your image is going to be staying perfectly still. You also have live NDs. Now typically NDs, you do have to sort of place an ND filter over your camera in order to do long exposure and have your water looking all smooth and cool, but with this camera you do have live NDs built into it. Now with both the Mark II and the Mark I, you did have ND filters, and these were great because they sort of simulate a slow shutter speed but enable you to shoot instantly. So you view them through your screen, you can sort of view the ND filter in live ND, which shows you how it's actually going to look. So it does take a lot of the guesswork out of shooting with ND filters, and well, takes the ND filters away as well. But with the Mark I, you could only go up to 64 ND, I believe, but with the Mark II, it is actually a significant upgrade and a world's first with 128 ND filter. So this is going to be great for some really great looking slow shutter speeds. So this is a fantastic bit of upgrade, but it's not the coolest thing about the Mark II. In my opinion at least, the coolest thing about this camera is the GND, the graduated ND filters. Now what this is basically, let's say you're shooting a landscape and the sky, it's just very bright in contrast to the ground itself. You place a GND over this, and basically what this is it sort of applies a filter to a segmented part of your image. So that basically balances out the whole image. A lot of you guys will be shooting nature photography with this camera, and it's often a bit of a shame when you do have, you know, a very uneven or very broad sort of dynamic range. So having that GND functionality it's honestly just amazing, and in some cases I do sort of use it to sort of balance out some images in general. Like you might have an otherwise perfectly balanced image, like a very narrow dynamic range, but then you just have that one little thing in the background that's just sort of overexposed or underexposed. And working with a GND, it just helps so much in the moment. It is great, it is very useful, and it saves me a bit of time in Photoshop. Although it is worth noting that with all these computational features, as great as they are, is that you do have to actually hold the camera steady while these features are applied, as you are technically combining multiple photos into one single amazing image. So do keep that in mind when shooting, that you often do sort of have to hold the camera still like so and wait for a second. But with all that said, this camera does have an increased RAM in comparison to the Mark I, so it does actually read out and apply those computational features much quicker than the Mark I. It's also worth noting that if you're not sort of crazy about having to go back into the computational features of the camera every time to set to specific features, you do have up to 4 custom mode dials on this camera, which makes it very ideal. So I can switch between custom 1 for high res, custom 2 for my ND, and custom 3 for my GND, and custom 4 for, well, whatever really. The autofocus in this camera, I'm happy to say, is fantastic. It's AI for autofocus, which is what I prefer in my cameras nowadays. It just makes the cameras overall much smarter, so I do appreciate that AI functionality. It can detect cats, birds, trains and planes, and well, animals in general, but it also can now detect human subjects. Whereas before, OM system cameras could only really detect sort of the face and the eyes. This now can identify a human subject. So it can pick out the human within the nature, which is going to be fantastic for a lot of us, as often when we're sort of shooting in nature, it's not just about nature, it's about the people that we go on the journey with. Now, when it comes to shooting nature, particularly animals and birds, you do want to invest in a long lens so you don't scare the animal off or have to climb up into a tree in order to get to that animal. Fortunately though, when you are shooting with a longer lens, it does make your footage that much shakier. So OM has factored this in and upgraded the stabilization of the Mark II significantly. With the Mark I, it could go up to 7-stop stabilization, which is pretty bloody good, but with this camera, it's significantly better at 8.5 stops. So that's going to be absolutely fantastic if you want to sort of use long lenses like this one here, and it's going to stabilize your footage significantly to the point that it's almost unnoticeable when it comes to shooting handheld. It's also very useful when it comes to shooting high-res photography or even ND live NDs, because basically you do want to have that camera be held still when shooting. So that sort of stabilization of 8.5 stops is going to be incredibly useful, and it's a great upgrade to the Mark II. Now, much like the Mark I, the Mark II does have Pro Capture. And what Pro Capture is basically the camera will take a bunch of images between a half press and a full press of the shutter button. So you no longer have to time out your shots with a perfect press of the shutter button. So if, say, you have a bird taken off a branch, so long as you can sort of get in that ballpark using Pro Capture will basically take several dozen images of that bird taken off, almost like a movie, and from there you can select the perfect image from those images that have been taken. Now, with the Pro Capture on the Mark II, you do have 3 different Pro Capture modes. You have ProCap, ProCap SH1, and ProCap SH2. Now, the differences between these is the frames per second limit. So with ProCap regular, you have a max frame limit of 20 frames per second, which is standard among most cameras, but with the ProCap SH1, you have a max limit of 120 frames per second, which is a crazy limit to have. So you can almost practically shoot a slow-mo movie from photos alone using the Pro Capture in this camera. And with ProCap SH2, it does have a max limit of 50 frames per second, but it also has 2 alternate frames per second limits of 12.5 and 16 frames per second, which is new to the Mark II. So you do have a great deal of options when it comes to shooting the Pro Capture on this camera. And in addition to all that, you do have 0 blackout on this camera, meaning you're not going to have any sort of black frames or black gaps between the photos that you've taken. It's all very much close together, which is going to be fantastic for a lot of you photographers that want to get that perfect moment. But it should be worth noting that with the autofocus in Pro Capture, you do not have continuous autofocus, you are limited to S autofocus. Now, the Mark I could also shoot 120 frames per second, but the difference here is the Mark II can shoot 120 frames per second at 1.7 seconds, meaning you can go up to 213 photos as opposed to the Mark I, which could only go up to exactly 120 photos. So you actually get more of that moment. You do have more time to capture that moment. Now, one thing you might notice when you're shooting Pro Capture is you will be locked out of a few features, as the camera does need to devote a bit of RAM to processing all these images you just took. So you won't be able to use the video and you won't be able to use the computational modes while this camera is sort of processing these images. Although you can keep shooting like quick bursts of Pro Capture, just keep in mind that the camera does need to, well, process everything. So don't freak out if you push the playback and you find that not all the images are there. The camera is still reading for all the images, so give it a minute and you should be able to read everything, especially if you've shot 213 photos within 2 seconds. Now, my recommendation is that you do invest in an SD card with a fast readout and a lot of memory, as if you do use Pro Capture, you're gonna, well, rack up a ridiculous amount of photos. So you're gonna wanna have a lot of memory when utilizing this camera. Now, that said, I was sort of varying between using a 64 gigabyte and a 128 gigabyte SanDisk SD card, and those worked fine. It didn't fill up the camera a crazy amount, but you still do want to be safe and sort of have that extra bit of memory on you at hand. So it's a good thing that you have at least 2 SD card slots inside this camera. Now, another thing to note about this camera is it does have a silent shutter button. Now, I looked through the settings and I couldn't get it to go loud. Personally, I do like to have my shutter button loud, as I like to hear that the photos are getting taken, but this isn't really an issue when it comes to shooting with the OM-1 Mark II, as often you are sort of shooting animals in nature and you don't want to scare anything off with a loud camera. So it's actually quite fantastic that you do have this very silent shutter button on this camera. It's almost, at loudest, could be like a little whir, but it's nothing ever scary, or it's just, you know, silent. So that's a great thing to have on the OM-1 Mark II. Now, a lot of the time I'm going to say in this video that the Mark II is basically great for nature, but with this Pro Capture, it is actually going to be quite useful for sports, especially if you invest in a really long lens. And, well, we do have an Olympics coming up, so this camera is probably going to be really good for getting those fantastic little moments with the Pro Capture. So there it is. That's the OM-1 Mark II. Now, my final impressions on this camera is fantastic sort of images, great video, really good build, but I'm not too crazy about sort of having to hold the camera steady to really make use of all those computational features. And it is a bit of a shame that I can't just sort of force quit out of those computational features outside of course, just straight up turning the camera off. So it is a bit annoying in that regard, but a necessary evil. As I understand, this camera does have more RAM, so it is faster than previous cameras, although I would have liked it to be a bit stronger, or used to use sort of faster SD cards like a CF Express, as it still was sort of buffering quite a bit when using those computational modes. In terms of sort of commercial photography or videography, I wouldn't necessarily use this camera, just purely because I like to use a full frame sensor. It gives me a lot more sort of space to sort of work with. I don't have to step far back to sort of crop my images to like a horizontal or vertical, and I have a bit more dynamic range, which gives me a bit more maneuverability in sort of situations where I don't have complete control over the lighting, like sort of parties or weddings. But with that said, this is a really good camera for nature photography. So shooting what's around me, shooting animals, this camera is absolutely fantastic. It gets the absolute best out of it. And those ND functionalities, that GND functionality, is really useful for the outdoors. It's a great camera for nature, for traveling. It's really light and portable, and it has fantastic battery life as well. And that USB-C charging functionality does just make it so much more easier on me. But that being said, I say this purely as someone who shoots a lot of commercials and products and all that. I would love to see this camera as a full frame sensor, but for a lot of people who are doing sort of travel and nature photography, the micro four thirds sensor is going to be way more practical than a full frame sort of sensor, a big heavy thing to carry around. The stabilization was also fantastic. I was using a 40-150 for a majority of the shots I was doing, as I can't get that close to wild animals, and the camera was so steady, and especially when shooting those computational modes, it was just a godsend to have that 8.5 stops. It really did help me in getting these absolutely perfect looking images. But I'm actually lost right now, so I should probably try and find my way home before it gets dark. So let me know what you think of the OM-1 Mark II. Do you have an OM-1 Mark I? How does it compare with the photos I've taken of it? Please let me know in the comments below.